Remember, Orby, once you are in hell, only the devil can help you out.
When the first Saw movie succeeded beyond all expectations, a sequel quickly went into production, being announced the same week Saw premiered and released just a year later. With one major caveat: James Wan did not return to direct, instead joining Leigh Whannell on the writing team. While this very well could have been a death sentence to a budding franchise, or the production company rushes production in order to capitalize off the first film, luckily it wasn't the case for Saw 2. By the time a sequel was greenlit, there wasn't even a script made. Instead, the studio brought in Darren Lynn Bousman to take the reins, and with him he brought a script that he had previously written called The Desperate. Originally, Bousman wanted David Armstrong, the director of photography for Saw, to do the film. Instead, Armstrong showed it to the producers and they realized that it would work well as a Saw sequel, later bringing in Wan and Whannell to adapt The Desperate into what would become Saw 2. Saw 2 does what every great sequel should do: ups the ante and the body count, shakes up the formula, and expands upon the lore. With the first Saw being the introduction to the concept, naturally Leigh Whannell's screenplay of the sequel is one that further explores John Kramer's character and gives you insight on his psyche. While dedicating an entire movie to a character study can be a detriment to a film, I believe it works out incredibly well, even if it leaves some tertiary characters a bit underdeveloped. Aside from the obvious leads, most of the characters are more or less indistinguishable from one another, particularly in the revolving door of victims in the House of Horrors that Jigsaw's concocted. But they do feel like real people, and Shawnee Smith is convincing as returning survivor Amanda, offering a convincing performance as sort of a mole and victim all at once. And it's a refreshing step up from the largely nothing characters from the first. Still, most of them are ciphers for conceptual work rather than characters with any sort of arc. And this kinda goes for John Kramer too, who serves mostly to instigate the thematic investigation and exploration of human will. And that's not to denigrate Kramer in the slightest, nor Tobin Bell, who gives his absolute best performance here. Whenever he's on screen, he's captivating, charismatic, and calculated. Saw 2 makes the smart decision by putting John Kramer into the spotlight, whereas he laid back quite literally in the first one, and he's easily the most interesting character in the franchise. And what makes him so effective is that he's the main villain of the series, but he isn't a physical threat like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees. He doesn't possess otherworldly powers like a Cenobite or Freddy Krueger. He's an old man dying of cancer, and his most powerful weapon is his mind. The biggest strength of this film is when we get to see John Kramer sitting down and just having a conversation with Detective Eric Matthews. It's during these conversations that the acting's the strongest, and the film also makes us think about Jigsaw's motives and methods, and even possibly makes us question if he's a true villain. And that's what makes him a lot more interesting than some of the other horror villains, because he isn't a mindless brute killing anyone in his path. He's very intelligent, and he chooses every one of his victims for a specific purpose. And with my quick and relatively spoiler-free section complete, let's dive in and dissect what truly makes Saw 2 the perfect sequel. And the Venus flytrap cold open is everything. Darren Lynn Bousman stays faithful to the world that James Wan and Leigh Whannell built in the first Saw, and expands upon it brilliantly. A man wakes up in a small room, surrounded by various medical supplies. Around his neck is a gnarly-looking metal contraption, and the area around one of his eyes is bloodied and swollen. The TV flicks on, and we see our old buddy Billy, looking fresh as ever. He tells our Tony Montana lookalike that because he's an informant, he's unworthy of the body that he possesses. Which seems a bit harsh. I mean, he's helping clean up the streets, just as Jigsaw believes he is. Maybe he's just jealous that Michael's work is being praised, while Jigsaw's is denounced. Either way, the mask is essentially like a Venus flytrap. If you can't locate the key in time, it will snap shut. Luckily, Jigsaw filmed a little WikiHow video to show Michael where the key is, and all he has to do is retrieve it. And even better, he gives him a hint, which he seems pretty proud of. It's right before his very eyes. Obviously, Michael is confused and enraged, as he ends up pulling the pin on his impending doom. He finds a scalpel in the tackle box and he cuts the key out. He cuts the key out? Michael cuts the key out. Michael cuts the key out. Okay, so all he did was put it up to his eye and then he cried for a minute, inevitably dying at the hands of his inaction. Cold open over, we meet the new kid on the block, Detective Eric Matthews, played by Donnie Wahlberg. And he's at a security office to pick up his son, Daniel, who's played by Eric Knudsen. Daniel ended up getting caught stealing, which angers Eric for obvious reasons, but he also doesn't want to spend what little time he has left with Daniel, due to losing custody of him, bailing him out of jail. It's clear they don't have the best of relationships, and Daniel wants to go back to his mother's right away. Obviously upset with the situation, and hurt by Daniel's wish, Eric responds angrily, and Daniel just scoffs and walks off. This eats away at Eric. He sits alone in a hotel room, drinking and smoking his troubles away. Eventually he calls Daniel and leaves him a voicemail, apologizing for his outburst. And it's clear that he does care about his son. Sometimes life's stresses cause negative emotions to supersede others. Eric receives a call back, hopeful that it's Daniel. Instead, it's his sergeant. He's being called into work right now. Okay, now this is a sweet transition. I love these, and Boosman doesn't disappoint throughout his tenure. Sergeant Carey gives Matthews the details, and we learn that Michael was the informant directly for Matthews. He IDs him based on his tattoos, and finds a jigsaw-shaped piece of skin carved out of his shoulder. On the ceiling, "Look closer, Detective Matthews," is painted. Jigsaw is clearly targeting him, starting with his informant. And Matthews hates this, hates everything about it. He knows the most dangerous serial killer in the city is after him, and he's scared. He takes it out on Carey, arguing in their office. While they're no longer partners, Carey still wants his help with this. He declines, and Carey storms off. After a sleepless night, he remembers something, the old Wilson Steel plant, and they put together a team to head in. With a full SWAT squad, led by Lieutenant Rigg, they break in and rudely interrupt John's Saturday morning cartoons with cereal time. As they clear the rooms, a group of them head up the stairs, when they trip the wire to send in the specialist, Billy, riding his tricycle. No convoluted riddle here, as the door slams shut, this guy gets both of his legs shattered instantly, and the other two get electrocuted. The rest of the team rush in, and luckily for them, that was the only trap. But realistically, John could have picked them off one by one if he wanted to. But where's the fun in that? Especially since this gets him face to face with Detective Eric Matthews. They go to arrest him and haul him off to jail, but Jigsaw's ace up his sleeve is hidden in the room across the way. In there, they remove the burlap veil to uncover a couple of monitors, showing a group of people trapped in a room. Detective Matthews sees Daniel on one of the monitors, sitting in the corner. This enrages him, and he marches over and demands to know what he's doing on the monitors. John, very humorously, replies, "I imagine he's cowering in a corner with a look on his face." John lets Detective Matthews know that Daniel has 2 hours to escape before a deadly neurotoxin breaks down his body tissues. "Hey John, what's your favorite Paul Thomas Anderson film?"
"There will be blood."
Oh, nice. But not to worry, Eric. John says Daniel's in a safe place. Obviously, he doesn't believe him, so he tries to call Daniel's cell again. In probably the most funniest, most trolliest Jigsaw move, John recorded over Daniel's voicemail.
You've reached Daniel's phone. He's not in right now. But if you...
All Matthews can do is helplessly look at the monitors and hope Daniel can escape. Speaking of which, we now begin Jigsaw's first group game. And we've got a pretty big group, 8 people in total. Right away, we find out that this guy spent some time in jail, and this isn't a jail like he's ever seen. They try to pry open the locked door, to no avail. They do see that they're being watched, but Daniel correctly steps in and says those type of security cameras don't have sound. Xavier, played by Frankie G, isn't much for all the yapping, and would rather start finding the way out. And he's actually onto something here, as they're quiet enough to hear the ticking from outside the door. Meanwhile, a woman wakes up from her unconscious state. It's Amanda. The first thing she did was check her head to see if the reverse bear trap was on her, and immediately my heart breaks for her. She already beat this game once, and now she's back for round 2. But at least she's the crafty veteran of the game, and she immediately springs into action, looking for the key. But she finds something even better, the tape player. That describes their situation at hand. In 3 hours, the door to exit will open. Hey, that's good. But in 2 hours, they'll die of a deadly nerve agent. Not so good. In fact, it's the same recipe from the Tokyo subway attacks of 1995, where 5 people from the cult of Aum Shinrikyo released sarin, killing 14 people and injuring thousands. The only way for our group to escape alive is to find an antidote, and there are several hidden around the house. In fact, one of the antidotes is right there with them in the safe, and they already have the combination to open it, they just have to look in the back of their mind. I wonder what he means by that. Jigsaw ends his message by saying, "Once you realize what you all have in common, you will gain a better understanding as to why you're here." X marks the spot for that clue, so look carefully. With the tape was a note. Do not attempt to use this key on the door to this room. I mean, seems straightforward enough. Amanda tells them not to do it, and given she already found the first clue, maybe I would trust her? The bravado bunch obviously don't, as Gus looks through the peephole while Xavier turns the lock. And that wraps up Gus's game really before it even starts. Almost immediately, Jonas confronts Amanda. She tells them that Jigsaw is testing them. Half the group seemingly have no idea who he is.
Who the hell is Jigsaw?
So Addison kindly informs them.
He's a serial killer.
No, he's not! He's testing us. He wants us to survive this. We have to play by the fucking rules!
Geez, Amanda, a bit defensive for someone who's been tested twice now. Back at Jigsaw HQ, Matthews asks what Jigsaw wants of him. Simply put, Jigsaw wants some of his time. And like I stated in the non-spoiler section, these scenes are what make this movie stand out in the best of ways. John requests that Matthews sits and talks with them alone. The rest of the team can stand in the other room with the monitors. Matthews walks off. He doesn't want to talk to John. He doesn't want to be anywhere near him. John scares him. He's familiar with John's work, and he knows how smart he is. Carrie helps convince him, saying that Matthews already lost his son because he got involved with her. It's assumed that this caused the collapse of his marriage and relationship strain with Daniel. While Matthews and John have their little discussion, the metal door inside the house opens, and the group cautiously push out. Well, except for Xavier, who finds a bat with nails. He's mostly worried about finding his own antidote and his own way out. The first person we see feel some adverse side effects of the nerve gas is Addison, as she begins coughing up blood. The group reaches the foyer and sees the exit door. Obviously it doesn't open, but at least they know the way out. Back to John and Eric for a moment, as the rules for his game are quite simple. All he has to do is sit there and talk to John, and he'll find Daniel in a safe place. Matthews already knows who he is. He's Jigsaw. But John doesn't really like that nickname. It was just the police and the press who called him that. The jigsaw piece that he cuts out of people was meant to symbolize that the victims were missing something. Survival instinct. Matthews isn't overly stimulated by the conversation, saying it's hard to go by the manual when Daniel's in danger. John is intrigued by this response, bringing up his old police brutality case, and then having the gall to ask for a refill on his water. Meathead Xavier starts breaking the exit door with a bat, only to find metal bars behind it. Jonas notices Xavier's prison tat, and correctly deduces that Addison also did some time, so that makes 3. The tape did say that they had more in common than they realized, but before they can get rap sheets of anyone else, Lauren finds the door down to the basement. Everyone heads down to find a mannequin with an envelope pinned to it that says, Obi? What the fuck is an Obi?
Obi. It's my name.
Oh, my bad. Inside the envelope is a tape, and Xavier plays it to reveal Jigsaw's voice. For years, Obi's burnt others through deceit, and played games at others' expense. So, now he must play Jigsaw's game. In the metal container are 2 antidotes, one for him, for helping kidnap everyone, and another to give to somebody. But one of them will come with a catch. Once you're in hell, only the devil can help you out. And that's probably one of the hardest lines ever written. Unfortunately for Obi, John kind of outed him as the kidnapper that put everyone in this place, and Xavier and Laura turn on him. Xavier is especially livid, placing the knife from the dummy up to Obi's neck. Obi looks him dead in the face, puts his hand on the blade, and slices his own neck, unfazed. Obi's gotta be the coolest motherfucker in the series. That shit was so hard. Even Xavier's shook by this, getting startled when Daniel knocks over a jug. Obi still enters the metal device, crawling all the way to the back where the needles are. He rips one down, but as he goes to grab the second, the door closes and locks him in. Flames begin to rise higher and higher. As he begins to panic, he locks eyes with some graffiti, a red devil pointing at a valve, with twist written to the side. Now remember, when you're in hell, only the devil can help you. But he can't reach it now, the flames growing with every passing second. Xavier manages to break the window open, and Obi tries to crawl out, but he succumbs to his burns, and he dies. Xavier is upset, mostly because he still has the antidotes with him. Back with Jigsaw, who started his Darwin theory of evolution speech to Matthews, saying that it doesn't really apply anymore because we, as a human race, have lost that surviving edge, the will to live. Matthews again questions what John wants with him. He just wants to see his son back. John asks why he's so eager to have him back, when the last thing he said to him was to go back to his mother's. Why is it that death changes circumstance? John says the knowledge of death changes everything. If I were to tell you the exact date and time of your own death, it would shatter your world completely. And that's when it hits for me. John, after getting his cancer diagnosis, was giving his impending time of death from Dr. Lawrence Gordon. It sent him over the edge, quite literally. John went to end his life, but miraculously survived. Thus, his testing of human nature began. Laura's feeling a little woozy here, but Daniel's at least somewhat of a support for her. But now that Laura's having a little break, Daniel can ask Amanda more about Jigsaw's game, and how she's on round 2 of it. Turns out Amanda was self-harming, which was the second worst thing that she did to her arms, as she started using drugs in prison. You know, no big deal, Amanda. We all have our mistakes. What'd they get you for?
Possession. Maybe you should talk to the cop who arrested me.
Sounds like Amanda got dealt a bad hand with an even worse cop. Pretty typical police work. She asks Daniel if he's been arrested, and he says not yet, but if he did, his dad would kick his ass. He almost tells her that his dad's a cop, but he refrains. Probably for the best. I wouldn't tell a house of convicts that my dad's a cop either. Upstairs, Jonas and the others find a door without a lock, but they still can't open it. Allow the muscle to step in, after a quick cough. After a good couple shoves, Xavier gets it open, starting the timer. Jonas finds an envelope and places the tape inside, and it's for Xavier. Xavier's a drug dealer, offering hope to the desperate for a price. Now he must crawl into the same squalor that he forces his customers into. Daniel removes the duvet from the bed, and Xavier removes the rest, uncovering a pit of used needles. Xavier announces immediately that someone's going in there, and rushes over and grabs Amanda, picking her up and throwing her into the pit. And it's heartbreaking. It's almost poetic. The drug dealer throwing the ex-junkie back into the thick of their addiction, sacrificing her for his own gain. What's worst about it is I think she's the only one without shoes on. Someone else, maybe Xavier, since, it's his test and all, could just step down and take little to no damage. Instead, Amanda has to sift through thousands of nasty needles to find the one they need. And it took 4 production staff members 4 days to set up this pit, replacing all 120,000 needles with fiber tips. As her screams of anguish filled up the room, Xavier bounces between remorseful and malicious. As Amanda rampantly sifts through the needles, the others can't bear to look. They turn the other cheek. Eventually, Amanda finds the key, slamming it on the ground in front of Xavier. He rushes it over, but fumbles it, costing him greatly. His literal key to freedom, that he received by using others, and he squandered his chance to make it out. But to him, it's not his fault. It never is. He goes over to Amanda to add insult to literal injury. Daniel helped her out of the pit, and begins picking out needles from across her body. The others defuse the situation long enough to figure out that Laura, too, has been in prison, further connecting them together. Everyone except for Daniel, so there goes that. Jonas wants to talk more though, but Xavier's done talking, saying that
The only thing you people haven't come is holding me back.
he goes to leave the room, taking one last look back at Amanda, who's sobbing in pain, and his look says it all. Matthews' calm approach isn't working, so it's time to switch it up. He grabs all of John's work, his sketches, his ideas, and all potential evidence pieces, and starts destroying it all, as John lists off everything else that he's done that's not by the book. Oh, shooting an unarmed suspect, planting evidence, just the standard cop stuff. John asks Matthews to grab something for him, a folder with the convicts from the game. Turns out that Matthews was the arresting officer for all of them, and planted the evidence that led to their incarcerations. Xavier returns to the first room of the house, where Gus is still hanging out. Unknowingly, he takes the coat off his head, exposing it. When he realizes he can't brute force the safe open, he goes to put the coat back over him, when he notices a number on the back of his head, and remembers what Jigsaw told them in the message. Jonas stumbles in, looking a bit worse for wear, and asks Xavier what he's doing.
What are you doing?
I haven't decided yet.
He tells Xavier that the others are scared of him, to which he replies, "Good." Jonas knows Xavier. At some point in his life, he was Xavier.
You remind me of me. No matter what kind of fucked up situation you're in, you always gotta find yourself an enemy.
Jonas tears up, saying that he's got enemies outside these walls, and if they don't get him, they'll get his family. Xavier doesn't understand him. He only has himself, and he says that's the way he likes it.
You and me,
Just before this moment, Jonas said,
we can keep going at each other like we back in the yard, or we can come together and figure out who's doing this to us.
and it's a cruel irony they find themselves in. These people who were abused by the judicial system, unjustly incarcerated, only to find themselves incarcerated in this macabre puzzle box of a prison, in order for Jigsaw to make a point about unjust incarceration. They might as well be back in the yard, fighting to stay alive. And that's just what they do, having a full-out brawl, which ends in Xavier getting the best of Jonas. After a moment, he checks the back of his head, and heads out. As the other 4 roam the halls, Laura collapses, now too weak from the nerve gas to continue. She looks up, fixing her eyes on a broken picture, the glass broken in the shape of an X. X marks the spot. Addison picks it up off the hook and flips it around, finding a picture of Daniel and Detective Matthews, and all is revealed. Detective Matthews put Addison away, and Amanda didn't want to believe it. And Laura really can't believe it, going into a seizure and subsequently passing. Addison can't trust Daniel. She can't trust anyone anymore, and she stumbles off. Amanda storms off too, only to quickly return after finding Jonas's body. Xavier begins his circuit of number hunting, finding Laura's body while looking for Amanda and Daniel. He also finds the lovely family photo before confronting them, and they run off. And Detective Matthews looks on helplessly. He's reached his breaking point. He walks over to John and starts beating the shit out of him. Somehow this only receives the bronze medal for Wahlberg's committing assault on the elderly. Funny how that happens. Addison stumbles into an unlocked room, finding another envelope, but discards it before finding out more. Instead, she sees a syringe full of antidote in a box. She sticks one hand in and tries to grab it, instead pulling the plunger clean out, letting all the liquid spill out. She reaches her other hand in, not realizing that the metal mechanism traps whatever enters. Xavier comes across her, but instead of lending a hand to get her out, he brushes her hair aside and finds her number, leaving her there to die. And I believe this to be the smartest and most powerful scene in the film. Saw 2 truly is a brilliant critique on individualism. After so long with no cooperation, Jonas tries to hash things out and level with Xavier. Xavier instead chooses violence, rugged individualism. Xavier hasn't changed. We've seen glimpses of a different side of him, but they're fleeting glimpses at best, and misplaced hope at worst. This is the crucial flaw with Jigsaw's philosophy. Putting these subjects into a situation nowhere near as rehabilitative as he aspires it to be, is his self-styled pro-life facade for pure sadistic cynicism that he learned from a society which he feels scorned by, and is programming this into these binary life and death outcome games that are nowhere near as fair as they promise. But he has the one thing that any of this needs in order to convince him, and maybe others, that this is the true way. A survivor. Amanda. And even then, my point remains. She's in this situation, her second game in as many movies, because she hasn't changed. She's still harming herself, just in a different way. I think all of this is pretty explicit, and it would take a potent mix of ignorance and cruelty to believe that Jigsaw's doing anything just. Instead, I think John represents how violent cynicism is often passed through a mixture of trauma and self-righteousness, and is expressed in a beautiful, poetic way throughout the movie. It can all be summed up with this scene, or even just one lone frame. The trap Addison finds, the box with the syringe inside. She's exhausted, from the poison coursing through her system, from the lack of cooperation from her new housemates. And she finally reaches what promises to be her salvation. But as she reaches up into the box, she accidentally causes all the antidote to leak out onto the bottom of the box. With the razors keeping her stuck, she's helpless. And it's a cruel play on the fate of Tantalus, doomed to forever want something that you can never reach. The blood that leaks out from her wounds mockingly mingles with the spilt antidote, creating this red gel for the light to illuminate her with. All of it is compounded with Xavier's response. Perhaps I'm giving it too much credit, but I truly believe that it's so rich in thematic depth that I had to break it down further before continuing on. As Matthews continues his assault on John, he puts his gun in John's mouth. Muffled at first, John says, "Game over." And he leads Detective Matthews to the house, and the remaining police try to locate where they may be headed. Hey John, what's your favorite Wes Craven film?
It's the last house on the left.
Oh nice, I'm more of a Scream fan personally. Amanda and Daniel return to the starting room, closing the door, making sure that Xavier can't get in. Amanda notices the blood of Jonas not pulling on one section of the floor. It's a trapdoor, potentially a way out for them if they can move the safe. Once they do, Daniel loots Jonas's body for the key from earlier, which opens the lock, and they escape just before Xavier busts down the door. Detective Matthews and John pull up to the house, and John gives them a key to enter. Also, the funny moan that John does always gets me. Amanda and Daniel run through the underground halls to escape Xavier. Matthews begins clearing the house, looking for his son. At the same time, the SWAT team breaks in and begins their search. But Detective Carey's not seeing them on the cameras. She doesn't see anyone new on the cameras. That's when they find the VCR setup. The feed that they were watching wasn't live, but a recording from some time before. Eventually, Amanda and Daniel reach a dead end, entering a dark room. When Amanda hits the lights, they see that they're in the same bathroom from the first movie. The poison sets in for Daniel, and he collapses to the floor just before Xavier enters. To Xavier, it doesn't matter if Daniel's dead or alive. He just wants that number. But Amanda correctly questions how he'll get his own number if she doesn't tell him. Logically, he resorts to the first thing he thinks of, slicing off a hunk of his skin that contains the number, pocketing it for later use. As he approaches Amanda for her number, Daniel springs up, kicking Xavier's knee out and slicing his throat with the trusty hacksaw that lives in the bathroom. Xavier falls slain, victim to his own self-assurance. Detective Matthews reaches the bathroom and Xavier's corpse, certainly a while after his death. He continues going through the bathroom, reaching the bathtub, where a hand hangs over the side. Believing it to be Daniel, he approaches, finding a person in a pig mask who attacks Matthews with a syringe, and he falls unconscious. At Jigsaw HQ, the timer runs out, and Carey turns around to see a safe open, with a sickly Daniel inside. Matthews wakes up in a daze, his gun and his light just out of reach. The only thing he can reach is a tape recorder, and when he hits play, we hear an unexpected voice, Amanda Young's.
Hello, Eric. You probably don't even remember me.
After surviving the reverse bear trap, John took Amanda under his wing, acting as a father figure, a mentor. Amanda served as both a player and a mole in the game, making sure the players abide by the rules. Amanda will be the one to carry on the Jigsaw legacy after John passes, and Detective Matthews is her first subject. Matthews is chained up by his ankle, much like Adam and Dr. Gordon. John explicitly told Matthews everything he needed to do. Simply talk to him and he would find Daniel in a safe place. The unbridled rage that Matthews possesses blinded him to the clues, that Daniel was in a literal safe, merely feet away from him. Now, Detective Matthews will lay in that bathroom, alone, scared, and in the dark, as Amanda emerges from the smoke and gives him the
Game over.
before slamming the door. John knows his legacy is in good hands, giving a wry smile in the car as we fade out. It's beautifully haunting. John Kramer, Jigsaw, still wins. And I have to give so much credit to Darren Lynn Bousman for directing, Lee Winnell for writing, editor Kevin Grudert, and cinematographer David Armstrong for a beautifully constructed film. Saw 2 manages to balance 2 A and B plots that are both thematically and emotionally rich. They don't feel disconnected at all, each complementing the other beautifully. I do find a lot of the traps compelling in themselves, but it's the moral and ethical coding of each character that elevates it. This leads to a lot of conflicts. It's a film that's quick to point out the flaws in everybody's ideology, but it never denies anyone's sympathy. Throughout the entirety of the group house trap sequence, where the main part of the film takes place, there is an obvious green hue with the color grading. This indicates the simultaneity of worlds, as green is a blend of yellow and blue, which are the other 2 prominent colors in the film. One world encompasses the victims of Jigsaw's house trap, including Eric Matthews' son, Daniel. The other is the interaction between John Kramer, Eric Matthews, and the police crew. It's revealed late in the film that the events shown in the house happened before Matthews and the police arrived. The subtle hints presented in the color grading and Kramer's dialogue emphasize this. Near the end, as the final characters descend into the basement, there's a notable hue shift to blue. They've reached a cold, sad place that could become their tombs. And I think the house that the victims are trapped in is worthy of both psychoanalytic and thematic interpretation within the film. The basement and the underground tunnel system are places where hidden things are revealed to both the characters and the audience for dramatic effect. In the house's basement, the victims learn that one among them, Abi, has kidnapped everyone in order to participate in the game. Abi then participates in a trap specifically for him, where he fails to utilize the full potential of his id survival instinct and dies. Later in the film, we see Amanda, Daniel, and Xavier enter the underground tunnels of the house. Here they find a hidden bathroom with dead bodies. There's a non-diegetic sonic overlay of dialogue and screaming from the previous films, a callback to Saw 1. Within the same vein as the idea of the house relating to psychoanalytic theory, the setting of John Kramer's warehouse is important to recall. Eric Matthews and the other police personnel are present in this warehouse with John Kramer throughout the duration of the film, where they watch the footage of the house trap, where Matthews' son is present. Eric is faced with moral conflicts, and he uses defense mechanisms such as avoidance and sublimation relating to his past, especially to his son, which he has seemed to neglect, and his previous police brutality and abuse of power. Eric assaults John, which causes him to lead Eric to the house, where his son supposedly is. In dramatic fashion, the room drops like an elevator, symbolizing that the id has won, and Eric couldn't control his animalistic impulses. In a traditional Jigsaw trap, having a strong id could be beneficial, but not in Matthew's case. It will eventually lead him to his capture. One of the more notable characters, Xavier, also falls victim to his id's impulses, and refuses to consider the problem at hand. He makes harsh decisions that violate Kramer's intention of having the group work together. However, he is one of the last victims to survive, and feeds his id so much that he cuts off his own flesh to be able to survive. Amanda, who was placed in the trap to ensure that it went smoothly, and Jonas act as the superego voices of the film, and the conflict that arises between them and Xavier are representations of psychoanalytic conflict. Also, the first death in the house trap is due to one of the characters acting rash and falling victim to his impulses as well. Amanda tries to warn him, but it's no use. Without ever explicitly mentioning psychological concepts or principles, John Kramer is testing and abusing his victims as they fight for their lives. John has a clear moral goal of getting people to value their lives while they're able to. This is revealed to be a product of his suicide attempt, and he's able to carry out his work as Jigsaw as a result of his terminal cancer diagnosis. However, Jigsaw's experiments and tests don't test survival instinct. Not only is there so much left up to chance, but the very basic psychological uncertainty principle renders it impossible in these circumstances. Okay, I'll admit something here. Before starting this critical analysis, I wasn't as high on Saw 2 as most people seem to be, but I see the light. I get the vision now. Not to spoil a potential ranking video or anything, but I previously had Saw 2 at 4th or 5th in my overall ranking of the franchise. but now it just may jump all the way up to the top. It can be easy to overlook just how smart and fun Saw 2 is in the wake of the rapidly diminishing entries that followed. But this franchise's second outing overall improves on the narrative strength of its predecessor, deploying simpler but effectively painful traps, and boasts a series of reveals and twists that focus the movie's themes on the interplay between agency and spectatorship on a deeper level than the previous Saw. The film does take a bit to find its footing, delivering a wholly unnecessary cold open and whatever exposition sequence for Detective Matthews. It does set out a few pieces that come into play later in the film, but the segment feels too unfleshed out to really land. But once it does find its grounding, the storytelling is rapid, gripping, and assured, not to mention really smart. The back and forth narrative deftly intertwines the increasing terror of the 8 victims in John Kramer's Hell House, and the frustration of the cops who apprehended them, offering a fresh take on the trap-based formula of Saw's first outing, and a meditation on helplessness and viewership. Where the first Saw invested its energy in the relationship between violence and spectatorship, Saw 2 focuses itself on the way that viewing can give way to helplessness. But it also wants to ask, what if patience and inaction are the key to survival and control? It's definitely an interesting place to take the franchise, and one that certainly allows Saw 2 to hold up on repeat viewings. Its most unnerving violence is remarkably bloodless, a live incineration and a pit of needles ramping up the cringe factor to nearly unbearable levels. That's in the best way, of course. Sure, we do get our share of gore. There's a bullet to the eye, the razor box, and Xavier's descent into violent madness. But it is notable that, at least in its second outing, Saw 2 still understood that not all physical suffering must stem from extreme bloodletting. The visuals help maintain the energy and anxiety of these disturbing traps too, once again deploying the shading and montage effect that underscored the first film. This time though, Darren Lynn Bousman and Kevin Grutert make better, more consistent use of these tricks, highlighting the fear, anger, and weakness of the characters involved. When Detective Matthews is on the verge of losing it, aptly filmed through a chain-link fence, his frustration first comes through in the form of jump cuts, before he allows this to lead him to take action that is ultimately ineffective, and it gets him killed. Saw 2 wisely uses its visual flair to underline the moral and emotional chaos of its victims in order to drive home its exploration of agency and patience in the face of great trauma and crisis. Of course, the nasty, sickly green aesthetic is back in full force, and the ensemble cast work beautifully together, even though the characters themselves refuse to cooperate. Personally, I think the balance between cop drama and the traps here is perfectly balanced. The pacing is perfect between two cohesive stories. Just as the police work begins to reel you in, we check in our season of Big Brother in Hell. While the first Saw offered some exciting traps, Saw 2 showed how powerful they can be. Plus, we get more insight onto how Jigsaw operates. Everything can be won, but not without a high cost. The epic twists and turns and shocking reveals lie at the heart of the Saw franchise, without a doubt, but this entry may just contain my absolute favorites. It truly is the most intricate, with layers of mysteries containing multiple puzzles solved only in the waning moments. It's always richly satisfying to watch the rapid cut sequences that remind us all of the foreshadowing and the plans for callbacks. It's shocking, but inevitable. It all becomes so obvious at the end. It could have never been anything else other than this, but I never would have guessed it if my life depended on it. Even after countless rewatches, the revelations still hold up. While Eric Matthews foolishly inserts himself into the center of this narrative, it's Amanda that creeps around it. She proved herself to Jigsaw once, but now must do it again. It's disturbing to watch her wake up in the room with the others, feeling around her head for the phantom trap that haunts her. She's terrified, but only for a moment. She's beat this game before, and she sure as hell can do it again. Amanda's ability to endure amazes and intrigues me, largely because of the contradictions that it creates. She can overcome anything, but cannot free herself from the pits she falls into. She exists in a terrible limbo between strength and weakness, and that disconnect is fascinating to watch. Her arc throughout the film is incredible, and the final twist is the cherry on top. That's not to put her on a pedestal or anything. Twisted moralizing of Amanda and even John aside, they are deliberately flawed antagonists, with a worldview converse to the theme of the film. Saw 2's grisly take on its themes turns off a whole lot of people. But if you're willing to tough it out, if you can endure exactly what Detective Matthews is asked to endure, you might just find yourself enjoying an expertly crafted and thoughtful piece of gory horror, and what I believe to be the greatest sequel of all time. Thank you for watching.